Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode of our Ghost series. This time, we're looking at what haunts the Old York Hospital. In January 1980, a group of parents and children from the Rockingham Little Athletics Club travelled to York in the Avon Valley, about 100 kilometres east of Perth, for a 5-day camping holiday. They selected a hostel which shared the facilities of the deserted 84-year-old York Hospital. The party consisted of 28 children and 5 supervising adults, including the club coach, 20-year-old Paul Harrison, and his mother Joan, who organised the camp. Their journey was made in stifling 37 Celsius and 99 Fahrenheit temperature. The bus broke down and there were other delays. The 100-kilometre trip took 5 hours. It was an omen of things that would follow. The Old York Hospital is an impressive large 2-storey red brick building. The group's sleeping quarters were in an annex at the rear, added many years earlier as the hospital's maternity wing. Attached to the main building were other facilities available to the visitors: a kitchen, dining room and a small sitting room. A wooden staircase behind the main hospital building linked to a rear veranda on each floor, and double doors on the ground floor were the hospital's only rear entrance. Certain internal doors on the ground floor were padlocked. The entire second floor was out of bounds to everybody. A caretaker and his wife and 2 Rhodesian Ridgeback dogs lived in a cottage at the back of the property. Mrs. Maureen Kramer, with her young son and daughter, happily joined the camping party, and Maureen agreed to become the group's cook. On arrival, she was disappointed to find that provisions, including cool drinks for the children, ordered 3 weeks earlier, had not been delivered. Undaunted, she set about collecting stores and preparing their first meal anyway. After the children had eaten and gone to bed in the dormitory, the adults sought respite from the heat by laying on the veranda outside the kitchen. That's when the initial incident occurred. Suddenly, without warning, the dogs appeared out of the shadows and made what could only be described as a ferocious attack on the group of adults. In the confusion which followed, the caretaker's wife appeared and called the dogs off. The group were very shaken, but by this time most of the children had been awakened and further sleep seemed impossible. The heat inside the dormitory was stifling. Joan Harrison suggested everyone, including the children, might be better off sleeping in the upstairs dormitory of the main hospital building. With windows open on both front and rear, they were more likely to catch cool breezes up there and be safe from those dogs. Everyone knew the second-floor hospital dormitory was out of bounds.
We were told not to go upstairs at all.
Did you go upstairs at any stage?
Yes, we went up the first night.
Too bad. The children's welfare was more important. Paul Harrison and Maureen Kramer armed themselves with torches and set off to investigate. They couldn't switch lights on because that would signal the presence in the forbidden area. The surreptitious pair later described part of their experience with Dr. Maurice Marsh in a 1989 TV documentary series, Haunted, which devoted a segment to the old hospital. We got midway along the dormitory and our torches went out, and we had a howling wind coming down from the chimney, said Maureen. A howling wind? How was that possible? The night was still, with not even a breeze at ground level. Paul elaborated.
We walked past the fireplace in the middle of the room, and both our torches went out. Now, at first I thought it was just my torch blowing, so we walked back 3 or 4 times, and again they went on and off, corresponding as to when we're in front of the fireplace and there again when we sort of came past the fireplace. But again, every time we walked in front of the fireplace for about 2 or 3 metres, they actually went off and came back on again.
Paul also mentioned a foul stench coming from a small attic room. To me, he said, it smelt like something dead, a dead animal or something. The howling wind, blinking torches and foul smell made Maureen and Paul apprehensive. They also felt the presence of some unseen entity in the room and retreated hastily downstairs to the others. Over a cup of tea, they decided to leave the children asleep where they were for the night. Then the Ridgeback sauntered out of the night's gloom, looked at the visitors and wandered away back into the darkness, this time showing no interest. It was then that the moaning began. It was soft at first, then increasingly louder. It was, Joan Harrison told the documentary crew, definitely the sound of a woman crying in pain, moaning. It was frightening, very frightening. The adults all sat and looked at each other petrified. Then with one bound they were out of the room and across to the children. All appeared to be sleeping peacefully. They all checked around the place as much as possible. The caretaker's cottage was in darkness. Finally they decided to retire to bed, each leaving all doors open in the building so that the children were well supervised. Coach Paul Harrison confided to his mother, "Mum, there's something definitely wrong here." Before breakfast next morning, Paul was proven correct. His mother Joan takes up the story. "The first thing that happened that morning, the Tuesday, was Maureen and I got up to get the children's breakfasts.
We got the milk, and I had this crockery jug, which I put on the bench. And I walked across to Maureen, and the next thing, out of the corner of my eye, I could see this jug lift and come across, float straight across the room at it.
I just stood there watching it. I couldn't believe my eye as it moved, and it came to the end, and instead of toppling off like things normally do, it just floated.
It was very hard to believe. And of course I thought then, well, it didn't just fall on the floor, it definitely floated, and because Maureen and I stood there shocked. We were shocked. Then the next thing, the stove would turn on and off. While you were using it, it had just turned itself on and off. It was a very queer.
And the doorknob, you'd be standing outside and the doorknob would be spinning, absolutely spinning. There was nobody else on the other side because we all checked, just spinning by itself. Further very queer things followed shortly afterwards. 9-year-old Kirsty, whose mother was one of the camp supervisors, was in the passage outside the dining room playing with another little girl. One end of this passage had a door with a glass panel of unusual thickness, about 3.5 to 4 feet, 106 to 122 centimetres above the door. Suddenly Kirsty screamed, hold me, can't sit down, stop them. Her playmate grabbed Kirsty's clothing but couldn't steady her. An unseen force seemed to be lifting the child and trying to drive her head first into the glass panel door. Fortunately, Kirsty had automatically raised her arm to protect her head. The whole impact appeared to have been broken with Kirsty's hand rather than her head, smashing through the glass panel. Joan later said that it was the most uncanny and frightening thing. The child's wrist was in a terrible mess. All the flesh was peeled back almost to the bone to several inches. Yet there was no blood spilled. The height of the thick glass made it almost impossible for a small child to fall through the glass. Paul Harrison added,
The girl was actually somehow thrown through the window, arm first. She, I think, memory search, had 12 or 15 stitches inserted in her arm.
Now this little girl, she's only a little tot, that's all. It would be impossible for her to fall and her arm to go through that glass. It was too high for the child.
How high was the glass from the floor?
Probably at 3.5 to 4 foot.
How tall was the girl?
Well, she was only about 8 years old, probably 4 foot herself.
The caretaker was called and took Kirsty and her mother to the local doctor's surgery. After he returned, Joan Harrison asked him directly about the hysterical moaning heard the previous evening. He jovially told her they had heard the matron. He told her a local tale that a previous hospital matron had been assaulted and that she could sometimes be heard running around trying to find her assailant. Judging by the smirk on his face, Joan felt the caretaker was making the whole story up. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Joan demanded that he appear that evening at 9 o'clock after the children were asleep, bringing one of his dogs so that he could escort the adults, including Joan, to the upstairs part of the building. He arrived at the appointed time, complete with one dog. The inspection party consisted of the caretaker, Paul the coach, Joan the organiser, Maureen the cook, Mrs. Otto, and 2 other mothers who preferred to be unnamed. Joan and Mrs. Otto and the dog only got as far as the landing on the stairway between 2 floors of the hospital. Joan had a serious attack of the frights, standing frozen on the landing, seeming powerless to proceed further up the stairs. Similarly, Mrs. Otto was too apprehensive to take another step. The dog's hackles were up and it refused to proceed voluntarily. Its owner dragged the frightened creature up the stairs by the chain around its neck. Paul and the 3 women nervously entered to the top floor ward, eventually overcoming their reticence. Those on the landing joined them. The caretaker was asked to unlock the small attic room, and Paul and Maureen entered it with him. The dog didn't go inside, but lingered, ready to make a quick exit with Joan. The sickly smell was almost overpowering. Paul admitted later he had a choice: hold his breath for long periods or be violently ill. The longer they stayed there, the worse the stench became.
It was only a very, very small room and there didn't appear to be anything in there, but the smell was still in there.
All of the women promptly returned downstairs clutching handkerchiefs to their faces. Legend has that in the old days, patients who had died and those who were about to die were kept together in that section of the hospital. Locals call it the morgue or dying room. Later that night, a bed check of the children found an 11-year-old boy sitting in his bed, frightened stiff. He was pale and speechless and clutching his bed sheets to his chest. It took quite a while to coax an explanation from him. He eventually revealed he'd seen a partial human figure materialise beside the door, a face in profile, a shoulder, an arm, and a hand resting on the doorknob. The rest of this person was, apparently, dematerialised. Paul stayed with the lad until he fell asleep. The adults, too, had difficulty getting to sleep that night. Apart from the warm, still air making them restless, the moaning and wailing sounds had returned. The matron was obviously restless as well. After breakfast the next morning, with rostered chores completed, the group decided to go swimming. Joan and her daughter Charlene and 2 other young girls opted to stay behind. They were sitting together in the lounge when the matron's moaning started again. Joan was determined not to allow the youngsters to become frightened by the experience, so she did her best to talk over the wailing, pretending she couldn't hear it. Certainly, she didn't want them to realise she was afraid. The moaning made no sense to her, and while she considered there was probably a logical explanation for it, she was in no condition to investigate further.
Did you only hear the moaning the once?
No, the moaning was every night, and it even got to the stage where a couple of afternoons, where I was left with the children by myself, a couple of children, it continued then. But it was every night.
She took the girls into the kitchen and they helped prepare lunch. That task completed, she sent them into the garden to play. The noises had ceased by the time the swimming party returned for lunch. After lunch, Maureen Kramer was approached by a distressed young girl who told her there was blood under the stairs. Several other children had also seen it. Paul joined the woman and together they tried to fathom this strange phenomenon. It was fresh blood, which seemed to ooze from underneath the staircase. There was no sign of tampering or of the blood being painted or smeared on the timber surface. Maureen checked the top of the stair and the higher stairs above the seepage, trying to establish where the blood was coming from, without success. One girl even tasted it and immediately confirmed it was blood. Oh, that's disgusting. Who is this girl? Maureen busied herself wiping the blood away and cleaning the surrounding surfaces. She also had no doubt that it was blood. A couple of minor incidents played out during the following afternoon, ensuring that the adults at least were feeling edgy and spooked. Joan Harrison felt a sharp shove in the back by an unseen force, almost strong enough to unseat her from the chair she was sitting on. Maureen Kramer yelled that someone or something had stuck a needle into her head, and Coach Paul had a door forcefully slammed in his face, literally, by the same or another unseen force, which then politely opened the door as if to bid him pass through the doorway. Paul quickly developed a lump on his cranium to substantiate the incident. That evening, after the children were settled comfortably in their beds and the adults were together in the sitting room, the moaning and wailing returned. The adults decided to drag their mattresses to the children's annex and positioned them on the floor close to its 2 doors. It was an automatic response. The sleeping children in their care had to be protected from any danger, genuine or perceived. They resolved to stay awake all night, and in case slumber overtook them, mops and brooms were placed across the doorways to form a barrier against unwanted intruders. The doors had to remain open because of the unrelenting heat. It was a bleary-eyed group who greeted the dawning of the next day. After breakfast, Joan Harrison approached the caretaker again about the moaning and crying and other strange happenings they'd experienced or witnessed. He told her to see the doctor when she went home, laughed and walked away. Joan's next surprise was a pleasant one. She had lost contact with old friends Sylvia and Don, who had been in York with 7 children for a few years. Joan was delightfully surprised when Sylvia called at the camp that afternoon to renew their acquaintance. They then told Sylvia what they'd seen, heard and felt during the previous 4 days. Sylvia was alarmed and concerned for their well-being and asked if it would be acceptable if she returned with Don, her husband, in the early evening. Everyone agreed. Around 10 p.m, Don and Paul conducted a thorough torchlight reconnoitre of the grounds and saw nothing unusual or suspicious. The caretaker's cottage, they reported, was in total darkness. The occupants were either already in bed or had gone out. Meanwhile, a close check of the children's dormitory by the women confirmed all their junior charges were asleep. Don and Sylvia joined Paul and Maureen, each armed with a torch, for a tour inside the old hospital. It was agreed amongst them that no light switches were to be turned on in case it attracted the attention of the caretaker, either from his bedroom or if he returned home. Obviously, they fully recognised they were trespassing in an area forbidden to them. Reaching the top of the stairs, they checked and saw the door of the dining room was securely padlocked. On entering the dormitory, they observed the door of the small inner room was locked too. They moved to the fireplace. Each of the 4 torches immediately went out. As soon as they moved away, their torches came back on again. Don and Sylvia were dumbfounded. The whole thing simply defied logical explanation. They moved toward the fireplace again, and again their torches failed. They moved away, and their torches came back on. They repeated the experiment 3 times, always with the same result. A startling new experience was just moments away. As the group moved toward a small bathroom at the end of the dormitory, they heard the sound of running water. 4 torch beams shone from the doorway onto a wash basin, illuminating hot water gurgling down the plug hole. Both taps were hard off. The hot tap was just that, hot to touch. It was implausible that anyone, anything, could have left the room without being seen by the group. There was no other exit. Stunned and scared as they were not able to quit their hunt. In whispered conversation, they agreed to check every possible hiding place in the dormitory. They looked into every wardrobe, checked in and under every bed, and opened every cupboard. Nothing, nobody was found. The foul smell was ever present, only this time it seemed to move around the dormitory and was not concentrated in any particular place. On the way back, they looked inside the dormitory and noticed a strange oblong shape in the middle of the floor. Thinking it may have been a shadow, they switched on the light, but it was not a shadow. Rather, it appeared as a small cloud of dark vapour, which slowly dissolved as they watched. Convinced they had searched all possible hiding places, the group were about to retreat downstairs for supper when they noticed what appeared to be a light coming from under the door leading to the attic. They had checked this door earlier and found it to be padlocked shut. Now the door was unlocked. As they approached, the light dissipated. They found no one inside. The 4 intrepid investigators continued downstairs for supper, trusting the others had nothing startling to impart. They had regularly checked the children and found them all to be fast asleep each time. The adults took their cups and plates into the more comfortable sitting room and listened to the accounts of the upstairs search party, leaving the torches on the kitchen bench. Then another weird thing happened. Everybody heard it. The kitchen door closed. It didn't just close. It was locked as well. Not only were their torches locked inside, but the caretaker had the only key to reopen it. They all sat there for a few minutes, debating what to do, when suddenly a tremendous noise or explosion shook the building.
A loud explosion seemed to come from, very close. Originally we thought it was a gas heater or a water heater or something blowing up.
Jones first thought that it was the hot water system exploding. Then everyone raced out of the building across to the annex. The children appeared to be sleeping quite peacefully, and nothing seemed to have been disturbed. Looking outside, they realised that they had left the lights on in the old building, but not one of the adults were brave enough to go back in there. Not without the torches. They were not game to risk going anywhere. That is, with the exception of Sylvia, the visitor from York. Her husband's car was right outside, and after a short discussion between them, she and Don woke their children, bundled them into the car, and Sylvia drove home to their own beds. Any mother placed in the same predicament would have done so. Don stayed on to help guard the visitors. By now it was only a few hours to daybreak, so the remaining adults began preparations of sleeping arrangements. When Joan and Paul went through the bedroom, they found Maureen sitting on a bed in a trance, with her face unrecognisably distorted.
She said to me, there's something floating up the staircase.
A fleeting object. I can't really describe what it was. All I know is it absolutely petrified me.
Because as we turned around and looked at her, her face had changed completely. You'd never recognise the woman. At first I got frightened. I would have said the woman had had a stroke because her face was so twisted you wouldn't have recognised her.
Apparently, from what I can gather, I knew nothing else for a few minutes.
One parent, that they call Vinnie, was sitting up in her bed and called out, "There's something at the window next to Joan's bed." If there was something there, it had gone before Paul and his mother reached the window. Vinnie swore she'd seen a ghostly figure and quickly pulled the blankets over her head. Paul and Don rested on a mattress on the dormitory floor. Other parents gathered an odd assortment of weapons and placed them within arm's reach.
Do then?
Well, we all went into the one room. I know it's going to sound silly, but we had, one of them had a baseball bat, cricket stumps, and even one of the ladies had a can of pressure pack fly spray. I know it sounds so stupid. What we're going to do with it, I don't really know, but then we had, everything was quiet for a while.
Unexpectedly, Maureen Kramer yelled out that there was something close to the door. Everyone sat up and looked in that direction. They saw nothing. Even as they watched, Vinnie started screaming and appeared to be fighting with herself. Suddenly, she was shouting to them, "Why didn't you help me?" They looked at her in astonishment. "Well, you must have heard me. I was screaming." She held her throat. "Didn't you see her? She had me by the throat. She tried to kill me." Joan Harrison suggested to Vinnie that she must have had a nightmare.
And then this friend that was with us, she was laying on the bed and she started screaming out, "They've got me by the throat." And of course we said to her, "Wake up, you're having a sleep," but she wasn't asleep. And because when we turned the light on, I said, "You've only had a sleep." I said, "It's been too much for you." But when we looked, there's definite marks on her throat. And of course, I think that was the last straw. I mean, that definitely, she said she had me by the throat, and there was definitely marks on that woman's throat.
Most were surprised into silence by what they saw. They shuffled back to their own beds, privately trying to process the experience. Exhaustion overtook them all, but nobody slept. Then the music started. Paul had set up his record player in the sitting room hours earlier and played just one record before turning his player off. Now it was playing that record again, loud enough to be distinctly heard in the annex. Neither Paul or anyone else was prepared to go outside and enter that sitting room to turn it off. That task would have to wait until daylight. Joan Harrison later told writer Miriam Howard Wright of another series of incidents that night. Joan remembers sitting quietly on her bed beside the window. The curtain was closed. She remembers feeling drained of all feelings and does not have the slightest idea as to why she pulled the curtain aside.
She said to me, "Don't go on your bed, there's something at your window, Joan." And I said to her, "No," I said, "there's nothing at the window." But I did, I pulled the curtain back and there was the figure at the window.
Can you describe it?
It was a very big woman, very, very big woman, like matron-y sort of a woman. And all you can see, it was the body, the head, but her arms were folded like that. Yet I lifted the curtain, and it shows you what shock does to people, because I must have been in shock. I just kept staring at it. Then I put the curtain back, and I said to him, "There's nothing." No, I thought, no, I'm not seeing it. So I laid on the bed, and I thought, no, I've got to look again. And I did look again, and it was still there.
She wondered why she felt so numb, so unfeeling. The more she thought about the whole chain of events, the more detached she became. It was, she explained, a strange feeling of not being anything at all. When day broke on Friday morning, very few adults had enjoyed much sleep, but a few surprises still awaited them. The kitchen door was found unlocked. Paul's record player was switched off. The record they'd heard playing during the night sat on the spindle with the needle arm on the side at rest. No one felt like discussing anything that happened overnight. They busied themselves packing clothes and cleaning up in preparation for the bus trip home. Friday was the final day at the Old York Hospital camp. For the adults, the prospect of going home was a great attraction. As arranged previously, Mr. Kramer, Maureen's husband, arrived to take them all back to Rockingham in the hired bus. Having come off night shift before driving to York, he had intended to grab some sleep before undertaking the return journey, but after hearing a few of the stories, he agreed there was something unhealthy about the place. Departure plans were altered. Instead, everyone moved to Sylvia and Don's home in York, where Mr. Kramer grabbed a few hours' sleep before the Rockingham Little Athletics Club group reboarded the bus and returned to their familiar and unspooky homes, where doorknobs didn't spin, jugs didn't drop, unaided curtains didn't hide ghosts, torches didn't flicker, and the peace was undisturbed by the moaning and wailing of one unhappy matron. Wow, the Old York Hospital. How creepy is this place? And so much going on at once. It was used during World War II, and the patients there were suffering from typhoid and many other diseases while the place was opened. And it isn't just the Old York Hospital in the area that's haunted. Locals to the York area claim that it's one of the most haunted towns in Australia, having a couple of hotels, a museum, and the Settler's House, as well as the old hospital. All haunted. It definitely sounds like a town we need to go and visit. If you like that episode, don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hit that notification bell. You won't hear any ringing, but you will be notified when we're posting another Ghosts of Australia video.
The Old York Hospital hospital was built in 1896 to serve the farming district and is on the site of a convict depot opposite the town cemetery. The hospital was used mainly by poorer residents. Wealthier people were nursed in their own home, where surgery was carried out on the kitchen table or in the patient's room. The building is now owned by the National Trust, which leases it to the state government as a youth hostel. In January 1980, a group of 5 adults and 28 children from a little athletics club 144 kilometres away travelled to York Hospital for a camping holiday. But their holiday was to become a nightmare.
They said, well, you couldn't put the children up there because there's something strange up there. And then we're sitting there for a while and this terrible moaning noise started. Well, at first you'd say it was the wind, but then when you look and you say, well, there wasn't any wind. It was so hot and still at York. So it wasn't wind, but then it got louder and was a definite sound of a woman crying, in pain, moaning.
It was a definite noise, which wasn't the rustle of the trees. It wasn't any wind. And the only way you could explain it was as a moaning.
It was frightening. It was very frightening because you'd swear there was someone up there in terrible pain. But I mean, because there wasn't anyone there.
I really can't give an explanation. A lot of things just happened that I've got no explanation whatsoever. I'm absolutely stumped.